Hi, everyone. Oh, I'm not good with microphones. My name is Olga Lautman, and I am the director of the Syria-Ukraine Network. And I want to thank everyone for being here for these important discussions on justice and accountability. After last year's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Syrian community had reached out and wanted to see what they can do to help. They saw the carpet bombings of Ukrainian cities, they saw the bombings of hospitals, humanitarian corridors, and schools, and this was so familiar to them because Russia has been committing the same atrocities, war crimes, and crimes of aggression for the past decade in Syria. And this is how the Syria-Ukraine Network was born. Basically, we are a group of organizations, Syrian organizations and Ukrainian organizations working together on advocacy, on making sure that all war crimes that were committed both in Syria and Ukraine, that they are prosecuted. And this is why these discussions are extremely important because, I mean, Russia for way too long has gotten away with impunity after committing war crimes. I mean, in Chechnya it started, then in Georgia, Ukraine, Syria, and now we have genocide happening in Ukraine. So again, thank you everyone for coming. For our opening speaker, I would like to introduce Roman Romaniuk. He is the head of the Secretariat of the Committee of Human Rights of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. Thank you so much.
Дякую, пані Ольга. Вельмишановні пані і панове, мені для розуміння і належної нашої комунікації англійською допоможе Анна.
Так, дякую. Я буду перекладати.
Перекладіть відразу англійською.
Так. Roman Romaniuk, he introduced me as an English translator, and my job here will be translating his speech from Ukrainian into English so that every attendee can understand.
Вельмишановні пані і панове, шановні учасники заходу, радий вітати вас сьогодні в Києві на такій важливій і вагомій події. Особисто хочу передати особисте вітання від Уповноваженого Верховної Ради України з прав людини Дмитра Лубінця, який і серцем, і думкою зараз з нами, сьогодні з нами тут, але, на жаль, працює по важливих завдачах для підтримки України і українців на міжнародній арені.
Dear respected guests, we are happy to welcome you here in Kyiv at such a significant event dedicated to human rights, war in Ukraine and Syria. And Mr. Roman Romaniuk would like to send warm greetings directly from Ombudsman of Ukraine, Dmytro Lubinets, who is now unfortunately very busy with another tasks, but with his spirit, he is today with us here.
Омбудсман України прямо зараз буквально очолює і координує питання допомоги у евакуації українців сектора Гази, складної ситуації, на жаль, яка має місце зараз, яка активно розгортається, і тому підтримка і допомога українцям, захищаючи їхні права і свободи, надзвичайно важлива і в особливій увазі омбудсмана України.
Currently, our ombudsman, Dmytro Lubinets, is actively busy with the task of evacuating Ukrainians from the dangerous zone of sector Gaza in Palestine, and in order to support human rights of every Ukrainian who was stuck in that zone.
Перш за все, я хочу звернути увагу, шановне товариство, що історія не пробачає помилок, і особливо історія не пробачає зволікання чи не реагування на своєчасне реагування на ті чи інші серйозні ситуації, які мають місце в різних частинах світу.
In general, history doesn't forgive mistakes, and especially not reacting on events on time, and that is why we should not repeat our past mistakes.
На жаль, але Щодо конкретної ситуації в Україні, ми вже маємо 9 років повномасштабної війни. Так, варто говорити і називати речі своїми іменами. Саме 9 років війна в Україні з 2014 року.
As for now, we have 9 years of full-scale war, and it is important to use the right terms, and it is exactly war happening against Ukraine.
І саме коли в 2014 році Росія зазіхнула на територіальну цілісність незалежної суверенної держави України, на жаль, цивілізованим світом і всім суспільством не зроблені своєчасні висновки, не вжито відповідних дій, заходів для того, щоб унеможливити подальше розгортання такої критичної ситуації, яку ми бачимо, починаючи з 22 лютого 2014 року.
And unfortunately, back then in 2014, when Russia showed its aggressive appetite on Ukrainian territories, the world, the international community did not react properly, and that is why Russia could get away with murder and basically repeated its actions in February 2022.
Якраз сьогодні у нас чудова з вами нагода ще раз вкотре звернути увагу на ті ситуації щодо своєчасного реагування, щодо необхідності притягнення до відповідальності усіх злочинців, щодо висновків, які потрібно робити вже і зараз задля неможливості подібних ситуацій, задля неможливості розгортання повномасштабних війн у світі, адже дійсно ми сьогодні, як світова спільнота, стоїмо на порозі доволі складної геополітичної ситуації в світі.
Exactly today we have a unique opportunity to draw attention to the measures that we can take in order not to let these atrocities repeat around the globe, as our world is currently faces a really humanitarian crisis.
На жаль, але світове товариство не робить своєчасних висновків, до прикладу, війни в Грузії, до прикладу, ситуації в Сирії. І тієї ж таки ситуації повернуся 2014 року в Україні.
Unfortunately, today the international community is not so active in reacting to the war crimes and atrocities happening, and the examples of it are the war against Georgia, in Syria, and of course events in Ukraine since 2014.
Наскільки важливо сильна, чітка і конкретна реакція цивілізованої світової спільноти уже на початку будь-якої агресії, будь-якої ситуації, яка тільки має місце зароджуватися. І зрозуміло, що будь-які диктатори, вони не зупиняються. І саме головне, що непокаране зло породжує, знову ж таки, наступні війни, наступну агресію і наступні злочини проти людства.
The important and fast reaction of international community is crucial exactly at the beginning when such crimes only start to happen, because the dictators then they don't stop, as our realities show, and impunity impedes more and more crimes, and that is why it is maximum important to react at the first steps.
Я хочу звернути увагу, наскільки важливо навіть уже сьогодні в цій складній ситуації війни України з Росією з підтримкою світового товариства притягувати до відповідальності усіх злочинців, усе військово-політичне керівництво Російської Федерації, щоб кожен злочинець, який вчинив злочин, був притягнутий до відповідальності, був покараний, і це було прикладом для ненаслідування для інших, щоб іншим не хотілося чинити подібні нехороші речі.
I want to draw attention at how much it is important for absolutely every war criminal in Russia to carry responsibility for the crimes that they have committed, so that the world community sees how it should be and how the system of reaction should work.
На жаль, Російська Федерація щоденно продовжує чинити жахливі звірства на території України над українцями, вбиває, калічить, гвалтує, вивозить, торгівля людьми, в тому числі незаконна депортація дітей. І це ті щоденні злочини, як порушення усіх норм міжнародного гуманітарного права, які чинить Російська Федерація на території України. І саме тому ми повинні бути єдині в бажанні притягнути до відповідальності злочинців, покарати і не допустити подібних ситуацій в світі в цілому, в подальшому.
Unfortunately, Russia is still committing war crimes at the territory of Ukraine every single day. It includes murdering, killing, human trafficking, including deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia. And that is why we must do immediate action now so that the aggressive state doesn't have this opportunity to do such atrocities in future. We must stay united not to let it happen again.
Життя і здоров'я людини – це найвища цінність, за яку варто боротися щодня, щоденно, всім разом, згуртовуючись над єдиним бажанням, щоб зла на нашій планеті Земля не було.
Human life and human health are the highest values on this planet, and that is why we must fight for them so that no evil is left on this planet.
Я бажаю усім гарної дискусії, гарного, хорошого робочого настрою і плідної, хорошої роботи. Дякую.
I wish everybody a good panel discussion, a good day and good work so that we are all productive and enjoy today's day. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this important message. And it is extremely important that Russia be held accountable now, because we see even with, Russia acting with impunity, that you see all the other autocrats and dictators around the globe who are banding together and committing their own atrocities. So this is why it is so important that we hold Russia accountable. They are at the top of, the global atrocities that are happening. Now I would love to introduce Ambassador Rapp, who has been working on these issues for decades. He is a distinguished fellow at the Hague Institute for Global Justice and former U.S. Ambassador at Large for War Crimes. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Olga, and it's great to be here with all of you, and thank you, Roman, for that great introduction. It is my fifth trip to Ukraine. I was twice here during 2014 and 15 when I was then ambassador for President Obama, but working particularly in making sure that the ICC would have jurisdiction over Russian war crimes, which was succeeded in, where the government agreed to that and entered the declaration that results today in the indictment of Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova for the deportation of children as a war crime, potentially also as a crime against humanity. I also wanted to work on the cooperation between Ukrainian prosecution and investigators and Western investigators. And at that time, it began with the organization of a joint investigative team dealing with the shooting down of MH17, the Malaysian aircraft that was shot down with a Russian missile by Donetsk separatists and Russian elements, we recall, in the summer of 2014, and that eventually resulted in conviction in a court in the Netherlands. It's been back 3 times since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. And working as hard as I can in this situation from outside the government, particularly with the association I have with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum that supports my work on Syria, on Ukraine, on many situations around the world, toward this goal of justice and accountability. My own background was in working in prosecution, and I was an international prosecutor at the Rwanda Tribunal, prosecuting the propagandists that incited the genocide, And then I was chief prosecutor in the Special Court for Sierra Leone, where there were mass war crimes and crimes against humanity, and we successfully prosecuted a chief of state, President Charles Taylor of Liberia, and sent him to prison for 50 years. We need to do the same things here. We developed, particularly in the post-Cold War period, the beginnings of an international system of justice. It went back to Nuremberg, but there was a long interruption during the Cold War. And we began to create a system where there was an expectation that when even great leaders commit crimes, they should be held to account. Unfortunately, in the case of Russia, there has never been accountability. We know at Nuremberg there was not accountability. The Russians are responsible for the murder of thousands of Poles in the Katyn forest near Smolensk. Barely admitted to that even recently, and frankly, we're charging the Nazis with doing that crime when it was, of course, a Russian crime, Soviet crime. And of course, never any responsibility for the Holodomor, the genocide in Ukraine by starvation in 1932 and 1933. And we saw that continued impunity in Chechnya at the end of the last century, and particularly as Putin became the leader of Russia. And then we saw it in Georgia, and then we saw it here, beginning in 2013 and 14, with the efforts to suppress the popular uprising and with clandestine agents to take over and invade and annex Crimea, and of course to invade the eastern parts of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk. And of course we've seen that now with this full-scale invasion and the horrors before all of the world. I've also been working on the case of Syria, and Syria was a situation where the international system failed. It was impossible to send the case to the International Criminal Court because Russia and China vetoed that reference. Of course, there was no hope in Syria that the national justice system would hold people to account because it was the leaders of that system, even the judges and lawyers in that system, the police that were responsible for the crimes. They weren't going to prosecute themselves. And in the case of Syria, we've had to find other avenues to justice in third countries, the universal jurisdiction, and have begun to achieve successes there. These situations have a great deal in common. And as one thinks about it, one sees a common theme. What was happening in Syria, and you see it in the films, from the springtime of 2011. Thousands of individuals, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people went into the streets. They dared to dream that they could have a democracy, that they could have a normal country, that they could decide their own government, their own fate, their own futures. That was an idea that the Syrian government could not allow, could not live with. So the response to that was vicious persecution. I mean, dealing with that time period when tens of thousands of Syrians are swept up, some not even demonstrators, some family members, some people just because they were from the same village as where there was known to be dissent against the regime, and sent into prisons, into detention, into torture, into murder, as we've seen in the Caesar photos. But it was a system very much designed by the Syrian government with the assistance of the Soviets. It was their kind of system, the system we've had since Stalin, of when you face any kind of objection to your regime, you sweep up everybody. You terrorize the population of your country. And the same thing, of course, happened here in 2014. People taking to the streets, asking for democracy, asking to be able to choose their own leaders, asking to be able to align with Europe rather than with Moscow. And that was something that the Russian regime just could not live with. And we see it in the viciousness by which Russian forces conducted themselves in the early days of this war. We see it from the evidence in Busha and from Izium and elsewhere. Anyone that was known as a supporter of Ukraine, an independent Ukraine, initially brutally killed and eventually then detained and in detention treated outrageously, often raped, tortured, murdered. We see it in the way, particularly, that they've treated the prisoners who you know, were under the bombs and attacks of the Russians in Mariupol, and who surrendered and were taken in. And I was talking not long ago with you know, with the families of those whose husbands and brothers and sons were in the Azovstal steel plant and went into Russian detention, viewed as having committed the most outrageous crime imaginable. They weren't committing any war crimes with bombs dropping on their head. They were committing the crime of daring to fight for an independent Ukraine. Most of the individuals I spoke to, their husbands and sons and brothers were still there. One described her husband having come back, having lost almost half his weight and a lot of his mental capacity. Still missing in a way, because the Russians had treated him with such intense brutality. Fortunately, it was possible for him to get out in an exchange, or he'd be dead today. That's the way they've treated the people here. We know the rhetoric that we hear it from extremists like you know, the so-called people's governor of Donetsk, that Pavel Gubarov, who, you know, said, you know, we need to, you're all taken by the devil, you know. You need to let go of the devil. You need to let go of this idea of Ukraine, or we're going to kill you. We're going to kill 1 million of you. We're going to kill 5 million of you. We're going to kill you all until you to realize the error in your ways. But you know, that's an extremist. But we've got this guy Gasparian, Armin Gasparian, and the Russians have distributed 1 million copies of his book that talks about the need to denazify and destroy the spirit of Ukraine and an independent country. That's the same thing that we've had in Syria, and the same Russian forces, playbook, and crimes that are being committed. You know, this is an opportunity now to work together to really achieve justice for the victims, for the survivors of these crimes. And it's essential, not just for Syria, not just for Ukraine, for other places. I was talking to Iranian activists that are here that I spoke to earlier, you know, who face the same kind of suppression and continue to face it today under a leader who himself was involved in sending thousands of people to execution when he was a so-called judge in that process 30 years ago, and is continuing that today. If we don't hold these butchers, these criminals to account, then no one in this world is safe. You know, we are all Ukrainians. We are all Syrians. We are all Iranians. And we need to discuss the pain that we've experienced, but then channel that pain into justice, defining the avenues, the means, which are difficult, which are challenging in a system. There's no world government. There's no enforcement body that's going to go out and arrest Vladimir Putin just because there's an ICC arrest. We need to find ways to hold these killers to account. And that's why I'm so happy to be here together and working together on these issues and sharing experiences so that justice can be achieved. Thank you very much, and look forward to the next 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Rapp, and thank you so much for all the hard work you've done and continue to do on behalf of everyone on this planet. Next, I would love to introduce Alexander Sherba. He is the representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a former ambassador to Austria, and author of Ukraine versus Darkness: Undiplomatic Thoughts. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Olga. Please forgive me. Until 30 minutes ago, I didn't know I would be speaking. So sorry for improvising. Thank you, Ambassador Rapp, for your very wise words and for wearing such appropriate tie. We notice such things. Thank you, all guests from abroad. It's not easy to travel to Ukraine these days. Especially the guests from Syria, from Iran. I guess I should be welcoming you in the name of our Deputy Minister and Regional Envoy Maxim Sup, who is Syrian Ukrainian. He would have welcomed you in his native tongue in Arabic, one of his two native tongues. He sends his warmest greetings, and as you can imagine, these days he, as the one in charge of Middle East, is extremely swamped. Yesterday was a very, all these days were very emotional for us in Ukraine. We look at things, terrible things that are happening in Israel, and we just recognize ourselves in many of those scenes, in many of those people, because many of those things happened to us during the last year and a half. Yesterday was a very emotional day. I was watching the interview of Israeli president on CNN, and he found the right words. He said it's not about religion versus religion. It's not about political system versus political system. It's about good versus evil. We call what Hamas did to many Israelis medieval, and in a way it is a greeting from Middle Ages. I mean, it's an assault of the past against the present and against the future. And the second thing that made me really I don't know what's the right expression in English that shocked me yesterday was the words a Russian propagandist, Sergei Mardan, found for this conflict, for this terrible tragedy yesterday. He said, well, we have seen Barbie, we have seen Oppenheimer, now we are watching a new film, Operation in Gaza, and we are thrilled. So this is the perfect illustration of what I'm talking about. Good versus evil, heart versus monstrosity. I remember all these horrible scenes I saw when working in Austria and in the United States. I think it was in the beginning, especially with the bombardment of Aleppo. And now I understand that Aleppo is what would have happened to Kyiv if we didn't have the support of the world. Unfortunately, Syria didn't have the support of the world that we have. And this makes my heart really, bleed for Syrians, for those people who suffered through this absolute monstrosity incurred on them by Russia and by the Assad regime. So we should finally start learning from such experiences. We should finally recognize that, just finding a middle way, somehow, what's the right expression, muddling through this whole thing is not an option here. It's really the global assault of evil versus good, of the past versus present and the future. So thank you for coming to Ukraine. Thank you for conducting this event. Congratulations, by the way, on the great name, SUN, Sun. Wonderful, wonderful. And let the sun shine the next couple of days. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexander. Next, I would like to welcome Hanna Hopko, a former Ukrainian parliamentarian and the founder and head of board of ANT's National Interest Advocacy. Thank you, Hanna.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you, everyone. And also, I think it's really important that today in Kyiv, we are discussing about justice and accountability, because Russian aggression against Ukraine is an attack on humanity. And we all we cannot justify what's happening against civilians everywhere in the world. In Israel now, in Sector Gaza also against civilians, because as the mother of a 12 years old kid, I cannot see without crying how kids are being killed. And of course, I remember when the chemical weapons was used against children in Aleppo, I was just crying, because this video still if for last 10 years, what is the most painful was to see the kids dying during the chemical weapon, and also the situation when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. But thank you, Ambassador Rapp, for mentioning genocide against Ukraine, Holodomor. In the eve of 90th anniversary of commemoration of Holodomor as the genocide, it's really important to understand that, unfortunately, the pain of millions of innocent killed because of hunger being a breadbasket of Europe, so we unfortunately didn't manage to channel the pain into justice. And Soviet Union, compared to Nazi Germany, they never paid a price and never held accountable. So this is why in 1991, the Soviet Union disintegration became the end of communism ideology, but not the end of Russian imperialism with Russian genocidal practice everywhere. We mentioned here also genocide against Chechens, and it's really important one day to see at the Red Square of Moscow the memorials instead of Lenin and Stalin, to see memorials to the victims of genocides conducted by Russian Empire. And it doesn't matter, it was Muscovy, Soviet Union, or Russian Federation. Because from the beginning of 11th century, Russia conducted almost every 4 years, they conducted new wars, like revanchist war or attacking independent states. And here today, I would like also to share my almost 10 years of international advocacy experience from 2014, the annexation of Crimea, when at that time, unfortunately, we didn't see the Sixth Fleet of the United States in the Black Sea. And after 8 years of peaceful settlement, I remember Minsk I, Minsk II, Normandy formats, chairing the Foreign Affairs Committee from 2014-2019, when everyone was advising Ukraine not to ask weapons because only politico-diplomatic solutions, only diplomacy could work. And what now? Almost 19 months, Russia is committing genocide. And the success of the West would have been happened if we prevent the genocide, if we avoid the full-scale war. So what are the lessons learned? We need more weapons. And actually, what is the end game of the West if Ukraine runs out of soldiers? Then what? The eastern flank of NATO countries should be prepared for real fight, and they should do it now. It's a serious question, and it seems everyone is ready to see how Ukraine is bleeding, but not ready to speed up the weapons supply like ATACMS, or German's version Taurus, or F-16, or to give us everything is need to finish the job. So also, when we are talking about the tribunal, special international tribunal, do you see a real political will in international arena to to punish the aggressor? Ukrainian law enforcement agencies launched an investigation into 107,000 war crimes and crimes of aggression. This includes the killing of 11,000, including 504 children, and wounding of 16,790 civilians, among them also children. So my main message, we need to demand a victory strategy from our Western partners, because it's about credibility of the whole international system, which is not, including UN, is not effectively working to defend the principles they were supposed to defend by the establishment of these organizations. And also, what we are hearing also now, there are some voices, some attempts for negotiations. How we could achieve sustainable peace. And by the way, the International Center for Ukrainian Victory presented the Sustainable Peace Manifesto. I would encourage you to read about punishment of the aggressor. It's a key. It's confiscation of Russian assets. Make Russia pay. Unfortunately, there is no political will for confiscation of Russian sovereign assets. We are hearing a lot of excuses why it's impossible. But what's about Russia as a terrorist state? Because we are thankful to 11 countries that Russia has been recognized as a sponsor of terrorism or a terrorist country by 11 countries and international structures like NATO Parliamentary Assembly. But it's not enough. I want to see a true leadership from our strategic partners. A recognition of Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. A recognition Wagner Group, Wagner mercenaries as a terrorist organization. Because all this terroristic network, not just Wagner, and Russia is behind them. So truth matters. And I remember how we with Ariana and Romanson from Canada, we published an article, Why Truth Matters for Justice. Without recognition of Holodomor as a genocide, it happened only last year at the European Parliament. Can you imagine? And after a new genocide happened, European Parliament and Bundestag recognized Holodomor as a genocide. And now when new genocide is happening, there is reluctance to recognize that Russia is committing a genocide because it's a combination of war crimes, crimes against humanity, it's ecocide, what happened with detonation of Kakhovka hydroelectronic power plant, and no even sanction against Rosatom. So this is why I think we can talk a lot and why it's really important, because this temptation to push Ukraine for negotiations now, some so-called peace plans, it's very dangerous for all of us. Unpunished evil, what is happening in the Middle East, what could happen in the Indo-Pacific region with Taiwan or in South China Sea. So this will all be part of their reluctance to punish the aggressor. And I'm very thankful to Olga and the team for combining Syria and Ukraine network, because I think it's really important that we are all as a humankind, human beings. So it's really important that we punish everyone. And what's happening with Uyghurs in Eastern Turkestan, what China is doing with Uyghurs, it's unacceptable. It's filtration camps when the kids are being divided. I think it's, I would say that Ukraine is not just breadbasket of the world, and we need to demilitarize, to conduct demilitarization of the Black Sea, that Ukraine guarantee the freedom of navigation and export of our grain and food commodities. But it's also, I would say, Ukraine is a spiritual basket of the world with a huge responsibility to punish Russia, to de-imperialize our neighbor, and through tribunal, through reparations. And I kindly ask all to join to the international tribunal and also join our campaign, Make Russia Pay. And we will be traveling now to Brussels, then to London, Washington, D.C., advocating that it's also a time to punish the aggressor state economically. They don't have more money to produce kamikaze drones, rockets, missiles, to keep killing civilians, destroying our local communities, critical energy infrastructure, ports, terminals. So I'm very thankful that we are here uniting efforts. And because this event, together with the Global South Crimean platform in Kyiv, it demonstrates that Ukraine sees its leadership, its uniting efforts for seeking justice, accountability for all, not just for Russia, but for other authoritarian regimes. Because Ukraine victory is a common victory of democracy, but sometimes democracy without weapons is blah, blah, blah. And I'm really trying to be keep being optimistic regarding democracy, but if democracy, and especially democratic world, will not learn the lessons and will not using all leverages, then I think we will see a nightmare globally. And I think prevention of new conflicts means punishment, including restoration of the rules-based order which was broken. So I'm thankful to the organizer again, and I do believe that one day we will be traveling to Moscow, seeing these monuments to the victims of the genocides committed by Russian imperialism. And also in Mariupol, we will see a new Nuremberg tribunal for the crimes against humanity, what Russian leadership, and not just leadership, did against us. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. And you made such an important point about Wagner Group. Another linkage between Syria and Ukraine. Around 2013 is the earliest signs. Russia sent Chechen terrorists to Syria to assist the Assad regime in the atrocities they were committing. Then they send several mercenary groups that, same thing, were committing atrocities, war crimes. Eventually, Wagner was born after one of the lieutenant colonels from GRU returned to Moscow, and then he formed Wagner. And that was done for the illegal annexation of Crimea. And it just shows, I mean, I work for many years on Wagner, and I've gone through the files, and you see the same repetition. You see a certain individual who was operating in Chechnya, then went to Syria, then went to Ukraine, back to Syria. Now they're in Africa, in Latin America, and basically this evil is spreading. And it is so important that we do designate Wagner, and frankly, every single other mercenary group that is under the Russian Defense Ministry's umbrella as terrorist organizations. Because, I mean, anyone who has read the UN report on what Wagner did in Africa, how they walked into villages, how they executed everyone in the villages, raped women, and we keep seeing the same tactics and methods being used. So thank you, Hannah, for bringing that up. The next speaker I would like to introduce, who will be via Zoom, is Farouk Habib. He's the Deputy General Manager of White Helmets, and White Helmets has done incredible work over the past decade, well, almost 13 years, to help Syrians in Syria, and they have undergone the worst disinformation and information warfare operations conducted by Russia. And I would like to welcome you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Do you hear me?
Oh, yes, sorry, yes.
Correct. Okay. Thank you very much for this introduction and for the former speakers. I believe the similarities are obvious between what has happened and still happening in Ukraine and in Syria in terms of the suffering of the innocent civilians and the repetition of the same atrocities and war crimes by the Russians and their allies. And the White Helmets is a group of ordinary volunteers from Syria who found themselves in the middle of the war and took the choice to do something within their capacity to save lives and to elevate the suffering of their communities. I was a banker in profession before the war. I never imagined myself will be involved in such kinds of activities. And I can imagine most of you did not choose to take this path. And we hoped we can spend our time building a better future for the next generations, for our children and for our countries. But with the ignorance of the international humanitarian law and with this impunity, the big dictators in the world enjoy, the suffering continue, and the conflicts are just moving from a region to a region because the international community so far has failed to uphold its own order and laws. And there are no consequences for these war crimes. During our work in Syria, sadly speaking, we acquired maybe the best experience in the world in dealing with airstrikes and bombardment on urban areas by the Russians. It's really sad, and it's a shame to the whole world to see these atrocities continue year after year and country after country. When the Russians attacked Crimea, there were no consequences, and that was the reason why they felt so easy for them to attack Syria as well. And then they continued their atrocities in Syria without consequences. They launched their war against Ukraine. And if they don't face consequences for what they are doing in Ukraine and still doing in Syria, of course, they will not stop where they are now. They will invade other countries. And here is our duty to remind the whole world that conflicts cannot be contained anymore. They go beyond the national borders. And no one anywhere in the world can isolate themselves and pretend that they have nothing to do with what's happening in Ukraine or in Syria or anywhere else. Because when a criminal succeeds and gets away without consequences, it just emboldens that criminal and also send a message to the other dictators and criminals around the world. They realize that they can do the same thing without consequences, and that will block the whole international system. In Syria, as we watched the war in Ukraine, we felt the same suffering, and we cried when we saw the pictures from Mariupol and from every other town in Ukraine bombed with the same kind of weapons we are being bombed. And when we saw the civilians under siege, when we saw the forcibly displacement of civilians, the ethnic cleansing and the demographic changes, we've seen the same tactics in Syria and in Ukraine. In Syria, we've seen the double-tap airstrikes when the Russians and their allies used to bomb the first location, and then after a few minutes, the Russian airships, they come back again and bomb the same location when the rescue workers arrive. We've seen it in Syria and in Ukraine. We've seen the besiegement of whole communities. And we've seen how Russia manipulates the UN and the humanitarian system by using the humanitarian assistance as a weapon of war and as a tactic to force communities to surrender. We've seen how the UN falls to the trap by the Russians when talking about the humanitarian corridors. For us, it's not humanitarian corridors at all. When the Russians besiege a city or a town and then offer a humanitarian corridor, trying to present themselves as saviors or as giving a passage to people to escape the war, they are actually doing ethnic cleansing. They are displacing people from their towns. Our demand should not be for humanitarian corridors for civilians to get out. Our demand is to stop bombing civilians and letting the civilians live with peace and dignity in their own hometowns, in their own homes. Also, we've seen the Russian disinformation war on Syria and Ukraine. A lot of similarities. In Syria, they call us terrorists, and in Ukraine, they call you Nazis. And of course, we know all of these are lies aiming at dehumanization of the resistance and the voices which call for freedom and dignity. We've seen the collective punishment here and there, same thing, claiming that there is so-called terrorists or Nazis group in that town or in that hospital or in that school, and use that as a pretext to punish the whole community, siege it, bomb it, displace it, and destroy everything in that community. And we've seen them also using the mercenaries, Wagner groups and others in Syria and Ukraine, everywhere. So it's really shocking how the international community kept watching everything. And then some countries make statements now as if they are surprised. I don't know where their think tanks and intelligence agencies all past these years. They shouldn't be surprised. Of course, when they see all these atrocities continue without consequences, they shouldn't be surprised when they see them happening again elsewhere. But what's important, other than, of course, working hard to hold the perpetrators accountable for their crimes, is to learn and to do what's necessary to prevent repetition of these crimes anywhere else in the world. Is to collaborate together, Syrian civil society, Ukrainian civil society, and civil society from everywhere in the world, to uphold the international law, to hold governments accountable, to protect the civilian lives everywhere in the world, to truly believe in solidarity and equality among human beings, regardless of nationality, regardless of religion, regardless of country or ethnicity. Children of Ukraine, children of Palestine, children of Israel, children of Syria, children in Africa, everywhere, they all have equal rights to live in peace. There is no justification for collective punishment. There is no justification to punish, bomb, or displace civilians at any circumstances because the atrocities committed from that side or another. We should be united on that principle. All human beings are equal. All human beings deserve to live in peace and dignity in their hometowns. And we should learn that unresolved conflicts will definitely generate violence and cycles of terrorism, revenge, atrocities sooner or later. So the international community ignored the conflict in Chechnya, ignored what happened in Ukraine, ignored the conflict in Syria, ignored the conflict in Palestine. At the end, of course, these conflicts will go beyond control at a certain moment, because when people lack hope in justice, lack hope in the international system, lack hope that they can achieve their legitimate aspirations through peaceful and democratic means, this is the best environment for terrorist organizations, for mercenaries, for dictators to invest in this environment and justify their aggressions. So we should all be united in support for these principles. And we look forward to enhance and consolidate efforts across the world from all believers in democracy, in human rights, to hopefully improve the current international system and build a better future for the next generations, where we don't see more pain, more displacement, more bombardment. And that will not happen without justice. Justice should come first, and that will help us to build a sustainable peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Farouk. And we keep hearing from every single speaker the same recurring pattern that the Western community and the whole international community has failed to hold these autocrats and monsters accountable, and we continue to see more atrocities being committed everywhere. For our final speaker, I would love to welcome Nick Yurlov. He's the legal counsel at Truth Hounds and has done an incredible investigation on Rosatom, and here he is to tell you about it. Thank you.
Can you launch it? صباح الخير. إنا حولش فرعان عزيمون إنا كنا هنا اسمي نيك وأنا مستشار قانوني أولا في Truth Hounds. Good morning. It's a great honor for me to be here. My name is Nick Yurlov and I'm a senior legal counsel at Truth Hounds. I'll continue in English since I have lived for 4 years in the Middle East. I have studied Arabic, but it was a long time ago and I have unfortunately forgotten it. But over this time, I've grown a great passion for Arabic culture and people from all different types of Arabic civilization. So it was a great pain for me to see what happened and what is still happening in Syria, because it was the moment I actually started studying international law, and then 12/11, the Arabic Spring, which was, in my opinion, a fantastic manifestation of democratic ideas in the whole region. And it was met with absolutely inhuman, brutal suppression from the regime of Bashar al-Assad. And then just as the democratic forces rallied to overthrow him, the Russians came in. Like in the civilized world, there's responsibility to protect, and Russians have the responsibility to oppress. So whenever they see a democratic grassroots movement emerging anywhere, they intervene and quell it and try to suppress it. So, and their excellencies and my distinguished colleagues have already mentioned this, that there is an absolutely clear causal nexus between what is happening right now in Ukraine, between what happened in Georgia in 2008, what is happening right now in the sector of Gaza and Palestine and Israel, and what happened back years ago, we started in Syria and earlier. It is the exactly imputability of the criminals, of war criminals, of those who commit genocide, of those who commit crimes against humanity, which sets path for new crimes to happen. Because those who perpetrate it, they feel that nothing's going to happen to them, because nothing has happened to those who committed those crimes before them. This is why our mission at Truth Hounds is to investigate and document the international crimes. And we've been doing this since 2014, when the war began, when the actual war began, and not as perceived right now by the world. And Hannah has already mentioned that it was exactly these 9 years of negotiations, of Minsk agreements. I remember speaking to German diplomats who said, no, you have to negotiate with DNR and LNR. They are the legitimate representatives of the people. And I was absolutely shocked. How blind do you have to be to the absolute lack of any type of representation in those regions? I'm from Crimea, I'm from Sevastopol, and I'm absolutely shocked when the representative of the Russian Federation in the International Court of Justice, an honorable French lawyer, goes out and says, well, I chose to quit representing the Russian Federation, but I still maintain that the people of Crimea have voted. N'importe quoi. This was absolutely without merit. His claim that the people of Crimea voted under guns, and this was and still for some reason maintains the mainstream view on my fellow compatriots from Crimea who, like me, had to flee from our own homes because of fear of being killed by the Russian occupying forces, and they say that we voted for Russia. So there have been many topics put forward today, and one of them is combating impunity, another is combating disinformation. And I would also like to thank you for coming here, for trying to understand the Ukrainian context, and how it is linked to the overall global context of fighting for freedom and fighting for justice. Because contrary to the popular belief that justice is something automatic, and even if the person dies, he will be tried by some supreme being, well, I respect all religious beliefs. But if we only hope for an afterlife, then there will be no justice in this life. And this is why we must do everything in our power to bring those to justice. So with this, I would like to briefly present the report that we made on how Rosatom, the Russian nuclear energy company, facilitates and is actively engaged in a massive campaign of tortures, kidnappings, and inhuman treatment of the staff and residents of the staff of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and the residents of Enerhodar of the Zaporizhzhia region. Next slide, please. This report was a joint work of Ukrainian NGO called Truth Hounds together with Ukrainian-Canada Bar Association working group on accountability for international crimes. We've also been assisted by senior energy experts Olga Kosharna and Andrei Kobolev, for whom we have our deepest respect and gratitude. So the purpose of this report, which I have a few copies and I can distribute to those who are interested, and you can also find it on the website of Truth Hounds, I'll provide the QR code in the end, is to shed light on the atrocities committed by the Russian occupying forces and how exactly Rosatom, as the transnational corporation owned by the Russian government, is engaged in it. Next slide, please. So, in a nutshell, what we did in this report, and I don't want to be taking a lot of your time because it's 60 pages, but I want to highlight the most important parts. May I have the clicker myself so I don't interrupt you all the time. We analyze the facts, how Rosatom employees are engaged in tortures, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, and we provide concrete legal methods of action to bring Rosatom to responsibility. And it's boom, 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 boom. Nope. Yep. So what we have established over 7 months of our work directly with witnesses and survivors of Russian genocidal occupation of Enerhodar is that Rosatom is in full control of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. They fully understand what's going on there, and not only they are knowledgeable, that they have also aided and abetted in the execution of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And in addition to that, not only that's a violation of international humanitarian, human rights, and criminal law, Rosatom, being a signatory to the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights, have obviously violated those principles. What that means is that apart from criminal liability, which, as my distinguished colleagues here can confirm, may take decades, there is a direct mechanism of action for those companies that work with Rosatom right now all counterparts in all of their business transactions, from the moment that they know that Rosatom is violating the guiding principles on business and human rights, are also violating these principles. And this is where we need your help, because Rosatom is like a giant squid which has spread its tentacles all over the world. And we, as a small Ukrainian NGO, do not have the capacity to find all of their counterparts and address them and send this report to them. And I ask your assistance in all of the countries wherever you have contacts, wherever you understand. And there is a separate map, which I can later show, which has been prepared by our colleagues from Dixie Group, showing their penetration of global energy market, where this can be addressed and responsibility brought in terms of business consequences for their reputation. And finally, in addition to criminal liability, in addition to business and human rights, there's also the question of international nuclear safety, which has been raised yesterday at the Crimea Global. The international nuclear law directly provides that, first of all, you cannot operate a nuclear power plant without a license. And obviously, Rosatom does not have a license to operate the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Somehow, the International Atomic Agency has, up until very recently, where they requested Rosatom to leave, and up until then, for more than 1.5 years, they have not been requesting. Finally, the IAEA has said that Rosatom must leave as ZNPP, Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. We need this not to fall on deaf ears. We need to keep this as an international international nuclear safety obligation of all states, because this is an erga omnes obligation, an obligation owed to the world community to keep nuclear energy safe. And they are they're operating a plant without a license. And not only that, they are also torturing the employees of the plant, which is not really helpful for the maintenance of the plant security. One particular evidence, which I'm going to read to you right now, is one of the is an employee of the Physical Protection Unit, paragraph 20 of the report. He was detained at the plant by two individuals believed by him to be the FSB officers. And as you well understand, the Physical Protection Unit is one of the crucial for physical protection of the plant. So it couldn't have happened without knowledge of Rosatom. He was driven out to a forest, brutally beaten, forced to dig his own grave. He was shot at next to his head, not to kill him. His head was forced into a plastic bag containing diesel fuel, and then he was held in a prison cell. After he was released, the FSB officers come to him again and say, "Hey, do you want to sign a contract with Rosatom?" Now, that's the way you really hire employees. Highly motivating performance routine, I'd say. But thankfully, he was managed to escape, and we interviewed him personally. This is just one of the dozens of incidents that we have documented where FSB tortures Ukrainian Zaporizhzhia nuclear power employees to force them to sign contracts with Rosatom, thereby proving the direct connection between the torturers and the Russian nuclear company. And the final evidence that I want to read is the one of a senior licensed officer of the plant, according to international nuclear law regulation. Licensed personnel are one of the most valuable on the plant, and they are selected. They have to be they're undergoing constant training, and they have to have significant experience to be in charge of nuclear security. This one was responsible for nuclear security, so this is an atomic physicist. He was summoned to his superior's office. His superior is working with Rosatom. He is a collaborant. And he was subjected, after this summoning to the office, to numerous beatings, suffocations. He was electrocuted with a TA-57 Tapik military field phone. His tortures were so severe that he lost consciousness a couple of times. And in the end, they asked him, okay, prove us that you are valuable to us so we keep you alive. He says, I am an experienced 50-year-old plus 30-year-old of post-qualification experience nuclear energy specialist. I am responsible for the plant's nuclear safety. The torturer said, we don't care, we have enough Russians to replace you, and they kicked him out and deported, so-called, to the territory controlled by Ukrainian government. This is just two examples, because I don't want to take a lot of your time, of the way Rosatom, and together with Russian occupying forces, conducts itself in Zaporizhia. And this is why our call to action here is to take immediate measures to avoid a nuclear catastrophe, which may happen anytime right now because of Rosatom's deliberate tortures of the personnel of nuclear power plants. The power plant is now understaffed. They don't have enough specialists. They have even killed one of the members of, they killed a diver who was responsible for entering the cooling pools. They tried to force him to find weapon stashes there, which were obviously not there, and they tortured him to death. And we have even more and more reports. So Truth Hounds are planning to conduct a new investigation to present new evidence. But what we need right now from the world community is assistance to bring light to the tortures which are happening at the power plant, which used to bring light to millions of Ukrainians, and not only Ukrainians. Ukraine supplied electricity to neighboring countries, to Romania, to Poland, to Hungary. This is why it is especially important for us right now to seek the world's support and stop voluntary cooperation of various governments with Rosatom. And we understand that nuclear energy is cheap, it should be safe, so there is a lot of temptation, especially when the Russians are using very low prices for their services. And short term, that may sound justified for someone like, for example, Hungary, to sign a contract to allow Rosatom to come and build their nuclear power plants, to supply them nuclear fuel. But what will that lead to in the end is something that is happening right now in Zaporizhia, sooner or later, if this is not prevented. So I know that this is not a very user-friendly presentation, but the report, both published and in electronic form, will be available at your request. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that we'll be able to jointly bring the Russians, including Russian companies, to responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. And I want to thank all the speakers for opening this important 2 days of discussions on justice, on accountability, on the bigger geopolitical risk if Russia is not held accountable, disinformation and all the tactics that Russia and its autocratic buddies use in order to discredit human rights groups and to continue committing atrocities and crimes of aggression. I want to thank everyone. Right now, we will take a 10-minute break, and then we will begin our first panel. Thank you.